When we speak the words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," we are not just reciting ancient scripture. We are initiating the mind into a deeply transformative framework, one that reorders our psychological orientation toward the day ahead. This is a cognitive act of realignment. In that single declaration, we are shifting the foundation of our identity from self-reliance, often brittle and insecure, to divine guidance, which is both transcendent and stabilizing. The shepherd metaphor is not arbitrary. A shepherd is a figure of responsibility, vigilance, and personal investment. In ancient culture, the shepherd did not manage from a distance. He walked with the sheep, protected them from predators, led them through both danger and peace. That opening line of Psalm 23 is not passive spirituality, it's an assertion of reality under divine oversight. The reason this matters, especially in the early hours of the day, is because every morning, whether we realize it or not, we awaken into a battlefield of thoughts. We open our eyes and almost immediately confront a dozen micro-anxieties. What will happen today? Will I succeed? Will I be enough? What if I fail again? And that worry doesn't ask for permission to enter. It just arrives, uninvited. That's why it is essential to anchor your mind with intentional spiritual declaration before those negative thoughts can take root. When you say, "But the Lord is my shepherd," you are declaring, first and foremost, that the burden to solve everything does not rest on your fragile shoulders. You're saying, there is a higher order guiding me, and I am not abandoned to randomness. Psychologically, this shifts your perception from scarcity to sufficiency. Consider the next phrase, I shall not want. That's not an expression of materialism. It's an act of resistance against the tyranny of lack. It's a refusal to let needness define your identity. In the language of cognitive psychology, what you focus on expands. If you begin the day preoccupied with what you lack, time, money, affirmation, certainty, your brain will subconsciously seek out evidence to reinforce that sense of deprivation. But when you begin with, "I shall not want," you're reconditioning your neural pathways to recognize provision, support, and divine orchestration, even in subtle ways. You train your mind to see not only what's wrong, but what's available. This morning ritual, if done consistently, becomes more than a habit. It becomes a structure for the soul. You're no longer merely reacting to life. You're responding from a place of rooted confidence. There is a massive difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is usually fear-based, impulsive and short-sighted. Response, on the other hand, emerges from centeredness. And Psalm 23 offers a template for that center. The shepherd leads, the sheep follow. The implication here is one of surrender, yes, but not passive surrender. It's informed surrender. Philosophically, it echoes the ancient Stoic belief that peace is found not in controlling external circumstances, but in mastering the internal alignment of your will with what is highest and most rational. In Christian language, that's called aligning with the will of God. This doesn't mean the day won't be difficult. But what it does mean is that your first move is not fear, it's faith. The moment you affirm, "The Lord is my shepherd," you're reasserting that whatever you face today, it's already been accounted for in the plan. You are not improvising in the dark. That may sound lofty, but let's bring it down to ground level. When you enter that meeting, when you face that diagnosis, when you receive that news you didn't expect, your posture isn't collapse. It's courage. Not because you're delusional, but because you're grounded. You've already rehearsed this reality in your prayer that morning. There's also a deeper point here worth noting. Dependence is not weakness. Modern culture glamorizes independence, being self-made, self-sufficient, self-actualized, but spiritually speaking, The greatest strength often comes from the deepest reliance, not on people, not on systems, but on a higher intelligence, on the shepherd who sees what you cannot, who guides when you're unsure, who corrects when you drift, and who provides even in drought. That kind of dependence reintroduces a powerful humility into our consciousness. And humility, contrary to popular belief, is not self-deprecation. It is the sober recognition of our limits and the conscious decision to trust something larger than ourselves. You could wake up every day saying, I have to figure it all out today. Or you could wake up and say, oh, the Lord is my shepherd. That choice seems small, but over time, it becomes the difference between mental chaos and internal peace. It's a psychological foundation, a philosophical orientation, a spiritual declaration, all in one. Begin the day with this declaration, not out of ritual, but out of intention, because the way you start your morning isn't just about productivity. It's about identity. And when your identity is rooted in something unshakable, the storms may come, but they won't destroy you. What you say to your soul in the morning is what your soul will say to your day. Choose wisely. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. These words from Psalm 23 aren't merely poetic imagery. They are instructions for the soul, a psychological reorientation in a culture addicted to unrest. What's striking here is the deliberate phrasing, he makes me lie down. That language is not a suggestion, not a gentle invitation. It implies intervention. And in a world obsessed with hustle, that kind of divine interruption is not only necessary, it's merciful. The implication is that we often won't rest on our own. We don't slow down voluntarily. So something greater must lead us, sometimes even force us into stillness. Think about the average morning today. The moment most people wake up, their minds are already sprinting. Emails to check, goals to chase, responsibilities waiting. The modern person treats rest as a reward for productivity, not as a prerequisite for clarity. But Psalm 23 flips that. It starts with rest. Green pastures, still waters. Before action, there is alignment. Before movement, there is restoration. And that restoration is not found in noise. It's found in silence. From a psychological standpoint, this is not just good theology, it's sound neuroscience. Constant mental stimulation creates cognitive fatigue. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making and focus, needs intentional periods of calm to recover. Without that, you're not just tired, you're functioning below your potential. So when the psalm says, he leads me beside still waters, it's not just a visual for tranquility. It's a prescription for how to remain sane in a world that profits from your anxiety. Stillness is not laziness. It's not a luxury. It is quite literally a requirement for inner order. But here's the problem: most people don't know how to be still. Stillness confronts them with themselves. It removes distraction and forces them to deal with the noise they've been avoiding inside. That's why so many fill their silence with screens, music, constant conversation, anything to avoid hearing their own thoughts. But when God leads us beside still waters, He's not trying to punish us with silence. He's trying to reintroduce us to our own souls. He's giving us space to hear what truly matters, to realign with what's eternal rather than what's urgent. There's something deeply philosophical here as well. We've built a society around acceleration. Faster networks, quicker answers, instant results. But growth, healing, wisdom, these things don't operate on speed. They operate on depth. And you cannot go deep in a rush. Still waters invite depth, not just emotionally, but intellectually and spiritually. In those quiet spaces, questions emerge. Who am I becoming? What am I chasing? Is this path aligned with my values or just my impulses? These are not questions you can answer in the middle of noise. You need stillness to access that kind of truth. Notice also the balance embedded in the verse. Green pastures and still waters. It's not just peace, but provision. Green pastures feed the sheep, still waters hydrate them. That's what divine rest looks like. It restores and sustains. It doesn't empty you of energy, it refills you with clarity. And that clarity has consequences. Because once your soul is centered, your actions become intentional. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding wisely. That's the power of a calm spirit. It protects you from impulsive decisions and trains you to live deliberately. The challenge, of course, is trust. To rest in green pastures, you have to believe you're not missing out on something by pausing. You have to trust that the shepherd is still working even when you are not. That is a radical act of faith in a world that glorifies burnout. It's easy to convince yourself that unless you're constantly grinding, you're falling behind. But from a higher perspective, rest is not a setback. It's a setup. It's the shepherd's way of preparing you for what's next. Without stillness, you move fast in the wrong direction. With it, you move slow but with purpose. There's also a relational dimension here. Restful people create restful environments. If you begin your day agitated, anxious, uncentered, you project that chaos onto others. But when you've been led beside still waters, you carry that peace with you into your conversations, your decisions, your leadership. You become an anchor in a storm for those around you. And make no mistake, people are desperate for calm. Not false calm, not the shallow tranquility of escapism, but the real kind that comes from someone who's been with God in the quiet and come back stronger. So this is the invitation every morning gives you. Will you let the shepherd lead you, or will you let anxiety drive you? Still waters don't shout, they whisper. And you have to be quiet enough to hear them. You have to trust that God is not just interested in what you do, but in who you are while you do it. That kind of inner life is not created in motion. It's born in stillness. If you want to walk with confidence, start by lying down in peace. The strength to stand later comes from the courage to rest now. He restores my soul. It's a short phrase, only 4 words, but it holds within it a universe of depth. What exactly does it mean for the soul to be restored? And why is that so critical to emphasize in the earliest moments of our day? To restore something is to return it to its original function, to bring back its strength, its clarity, its alignment with purpose. The word itself implies that some damage has occurred, that something has been diminished, distorted, or drained. The soul, like any other part of the human condition, is not immune to wear and tear. It absorbs the disappointments of the day before, the tensions we didn't resolve, the criticisms we internalized, the moments where we betrayed our own values just to keep the peace or maintain approval. These aren't minor occurrences. They leave marks. And left unaddressed, they build up into a state of chronic inner depletion. What many today call burnout, but which is more precisely spiritual exhaustion. Now, this isn't merely about emotional fatigue. It goes deeper than that. The soul is the integrative center of your being. It's the place where mind, heart, and spirit converge. When the soul is off, everything else follows. You can eat well, exercise daily, succeed outwardly, and still feel internally fragmented. That's because no amount of external success can compensate for a soul that hasn't been cared for. And we live in a world where very few know how to tend to the soul. Where to go for its healing, what language to speak to it, how to even recognize when it's injured. Psalm 23 doesn't offer a self-help technique here. It makes a bold claim, "Oh, hell restores my soul." That pronoun matters. Restoration is not ultimately something we can manufacture on our own. We can numb, distract, manage symptoms. But to be deeply restored, to feel truly whole again, requires more than human willpower. It requires divine intervention. And this, intellectually, is one of the most countercultural assertions in Scripture, that healing is relational, not mechanical. That your soul is not a machine to be repaired, but to be cared for, and that care comes from a source outside yourself. This is where the modern narrative autonomy collides with biblical wisdom. We've been taught that if we just think hard enough, work long enough, or optimize our habits cleverly enough, we can fix anything. But the soul doesn't work like that. It doesn't respond to optimization. It responds to love, to presence, to truth. And the shepherd in Psalm 23 is not an algorithm. He's a person, one who sees the cracks that even we ourselves have learned to ignore. From a psychological perspective, the process of restoration begins with acknowledgement. Before anything can be restored, it must be seen as broken. And this is where many stall. We are uncomfortable with our own limits. We'd rather posture strength than admit the need for healing. But healing is impossible without humility. That's why the phrase, "restores my soul," is more than comfort. It's an act of surrender. It's a confession that I cannot keep myself whole on my own. Interestingly, restoration is not the same as recreation. God doesn't throw the soul away and start over. He takes what's been weathered by life, what's been trampled by disappointment, and he brings it back to life. That includes our ability to trust again after betrayal, our willingness to risk again after failure, our capacity to love again after loss. The restoration of the soul is the slow and steady reawakening of the parts of you that hardship tried to silence. It's also important to see that restoration is not a one-time event. It's a rhythm. Just like sleep is to the body, restoration is to the soul. You don't get restored once and remain that way forever. Every day presents new sources of fatigue, new emotional burdens, new reasons to harden your heart or numb your awareness. That's why this verse is especially relevant as a morning prayer. It's not just a reflection of what God once did. It's a request for what you need him to do again today. There's a subtle wisdom here. Most of the time we focus on getting more energy, more motivation, more drive, more stimulation. But what if the real issue isn't that you need more energy? What if the real issue is that your soul is wounded and no amount of caffeine or discipline or external validation can touch that place? The soul doesn't need noise. It needs nurturing. And that's what restoration offers, not a boost, but a return to essence. Not an escape, but a realignment. So in the quiet of the morning, before the world demands anything of you, this becomes the starting point. God, restore my soul. It's not weakness to say that. It's wisdom. It's the kind of self-awareness that leads to resilience. Because the truth is, no one gets through this life unscathed. But not everyone allows themselves to be healed. The most powerful people are not the ones who never break. They are the ones who learn how to be restored. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. This single line carries a theological and psychological weight that cannot be overstated. It's a declaration of moral order, of existential direction, and of divine responsibility. Not just for our protection, but for our character formation. When we speak this verse aloud in our morning prayer, we're not merely asking to be spared from wrongdoing. We're actively surrendering our autonomy to a deeper moral structure that operates beyond impulse and preference. We're confessing that our day requires more than instinct and convenience. It requires guidance. And not just any guidance, righteous guidance. Now, righteousness is a concept often misunderstood. In modern parlance, it's sometimes reduced to religious legalism or moral superiority. But in the biblical and psychological sense, righteousness is about alignment. It's about being rightly ordered, internally and externally. It means your motives, your thoughts, and your outcomes are not fragmented, but harmonized with what is true, good, and just. And that level of coherence cannot be achieved by sheer willpower alone. It requires leadership. It requires being led. There's something remarkably humbling about that realization. As autonomous beings, we want to believe we can chart our own course. That, if we're just smart enough or principled enough, we can find our way. But this verse challenges that assumption. It acknowledges that even with the best intentions, we often wander, not necessarily out of rebellion, but out of confusion, distraction, or fatigue. And so, the psalmist offers something radically different than self-determination, and he leads me in paths of righteousness. In other words, direction must be received, not invented. This is where the philosophical depth of the verse comes alive. We live in an age that prizes self-authorship. Find your truth. Follow your heart. Do what feels right. These are the mantras of modern culture, but they are tragically insufficient for a meaningful life because your heart can deceive you. Your truth can change with your emotions, and what feels right isn't always what is right. So Psalm 23 presents a different paradigm, one that places trust not in the self, but in the shepherd. It suggests that truth is not something you construct, but something you follow. And that following, by definition, implies humility. From a psychological standpoint, this shift has enormous implications. When we relinquish the need to control every outcome and instead focus on walking the path of righteousness, meaning doing what is morally sound, what is courageous, honest, we free ourselves from the tyranny of comparison and perfectionism. We no longer need to obsess over whether we're successful, admired, or accomplished as others. That's not our lane. Our lane is righteousness. Our lane is integrity. Our lane is obedience to right, even when it's inconvenient or invisible to others. And this brings us to a difficult but essential truth on righteousness often comes at a cost. It rarely aligns with comfort. The right path is not always the easiest one, and it's almost never the most popular. To walk in righteousness means you will have to say no when others say yes. It means taking responsibility when it would be easier to shift blame. It means standing in truth even when that truth alienates you. And that is precisely why we need a shepherd. Because left to ourselves, we would almost always choose the path of least resistance. But God leads us on the path of higher resistance, for the sake of higher purpose. Interestingly, the psalm says he does you for his name's sake. That phrase isn't about ego, it's about essence. In ancient Hebrew culture, a name wasn't just a label. It represented identity, character, reputation. So when the text says that the God leads us in righteousness for his name's sake, it means his very nature is bound to our direction. He cannot be who he is and not lead us well. His moral integrity demands that he guides us toward what is best for us, even if it costs us something in the short term. This is also a powerful source of assurance, because it means your ability to stay on the right path isn't entirely dependent on your strength. It's rooted in his faithfulness. Even when you stumble, he continues to lead. Even when you drift, he redirects. That doesn't excuse negligence or moral laziness, but it does remove the crushing burden of perfectionism. You are being led. That's the operative truth. You're not navigating blind. You're not inventing meaning out of chaos. You are walking a path designed with purpose by a guide who is both wise and good. And the practical outworking of that truth is profound. When you start your morning with the awareness that you are being led in righteousness, you begin to look at your decisions differently. Small choices take on larger significance. You ask different questions. Not just what do I want, but what is right. Not what will they think of me, but is this aligned with truth? This inner compass, routed in something beyond yourself, becomes your daily guide. And the more you listen, the clearer it gets. If you want to live a meaningful life, stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be aligned. Because when you walk the path of righteousness, you may not always be celebrated, but you will always be centered. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. This is not the language of fantasy. It's the language of realism. It doesn't say, if I walk through the valley. It says, even though. That subtle shift matters because it reflects an inescapable truthing hardship is not an interruption to life. It is part of life. And more than that, it's a part that tests the very fabric of what you believe. From a psychological standpoint, the valley of the shadow of death represents any moment in which the familiar structures of meaning seem to collapse. That could be grief, trauma, betrayal, depression, the loss of someone you loved, or the shattering of an identity you built your life upon. In those moments, you're not just enduring difficulty. You're walking through the shadow of existential uncertainty. It's the loss of clarity, the suffocating fog of anxiety, the creeping sense that you're alone in the chaos. And yet this verse meets us precisely there. Not by denying the valley, not by minimizing the darkness, but by inserting one powerful truth into it. You are with me. What's fascinating is how the tone of Psalm 23 shifts here. Up until this point, the psalmist speaks to you about God. He makes me lie down. He leads me. He restores my soul. But now, in the valley, he stops talking about God and starts talking to him. You are with me. That shift is psychologically profound. It suggests that intimacy is often forged not in success, but in suffering. It's in the crisis, not the comfort, that our relationship with the divine becomes personal, direct, and urgent. And in a culture where we are trained to numb our pain or avoid it altogether, this passage pushes us into the heart of it. Not to be consumed by darkness, but to find presence in the middle of it. We often assume that the goal of faith is to avoid the valley. But in Scripture, the goal is different. It's to walk through it and to do so without fear. Now, let's be clear. Fear is a rational response to danger. The point here is not that fear is invalid. The point is that fear doesn't have to dominate. It doesn't get to drive your decisions. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward despite it. And this verse is a declaration of that courage. Not grounded in self-confidence, but in relational security. For you are with Meg. This is where theology intersects with psychology again in a very meaningful way. The presence of a trusted companion in a threatening environment changes your brain's response. Neuroscience has shown that co-regulation, sharing a stressful experience with someone who is calm, reduces anxiety and increases resilience. That's not just a spiritual metaphor, it's biological fact. Now apply that principle to this verse. The assurance of God's presence doesn't just make the valley bearable. It transforms the way your nervous system processes threat. You're not isolated in fear. You're anchored in relationship. It's also worth paying attention to the poetic imagery of the valley of the shadow of death. Not death itself, but its shadow. A shadow only exists if there is light somewhere nearby. That detail matters. Even in our darkest seasons, there is evidence of light. Perhaps not visible in the moment, but implied by the very presence of the shadow itself. And that light, that source of meaning and truth, is not extinguished by suffering. It may be obscured, but it remains. This realization is critical because it reframes the valley not as a final destination, but as a passage. You walk well through it. You don't set up camp in it. You keep moving. The idea of walking, not running, not panicking, but walking, is also psychologically wise. In moments of distress, your impulse may be to escape, to numb, to avoid. But this passage says, keep going, one step at a time. There's no demand for perfection, just progress. Steady, faithful movement through pain toward restoration. And that is the way out. Not denial, not distraction. Just honest, grounded movement with the knowledge that you're not walking alone. Now, let's talk about evil. I will fear no evil is not a claim that evil does not exist. It's an assertion that evil does not get the final say. It doesn't paralyze the soul. It doesn't define the story. Why? Because of who is walking beside you. The presence of God dismantles the power of evil. Not necessarily by removing it, but by stripping it of its control over your heart and your mind. That's a higher kind of victory. It's not circumstantial, it's spiritual. And it creates a kind of inner fortitude that external suffering cannot dissolve. So every morning when you wake up and speak this verse, you're not just reciting poetic comfort. You're rehearsing your strategy for facing a chaotic world. You're reminding yourself that valleys will come. Personal, emotional, relational, even spiritual. But they are not where you end. They are where you walk through. And you walk through them not because you're strong, but because you're not alone. Your confidence today does not come from the absence of darkness. It comes from the presence of light that cannot be overcome. And that truth, quiet, solid, unshaken, is enough to carry you through anything. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. This verse is rich in paradox. It portrays abundance, celebration, and honor, yet not in a serene garden or peaceful retreat. It all takes place right there in front of your enemies. That's not just poetic, it's deeply psychological. It invites us to confront a fundamental truth, and peace is not the absence of conflict, but the defiant presence of grace in the midst of it. The table here is more than just a meal. It's a declaration. In the ancient world, to prepare a table was to establish fellowship, to signify security and provision. But God doesn't wait until your enemies are gone to lay out this feast. He prepares it right there, in plain sight of everything and everyone that once threatened to destroy you. This is where we encounter one of the core tensions of human development. The ability to flourish while under pressure. It's not that God removes opposition before blessing you. It's that He blesses you in spite of opposition. That image breaks our expectations. Most of us are conditioned to believe that security must precede abundance, that everything must be in order before we can enjoy what's ours. But this psalm turns that narrative on its head. Think about how psychologically profound that is. Many people are waiting for their enemies to disappear, their critics to be silenced, their fears to be resolved, their circumstances to become ideal before they embrace their worth or walk in purpose. But Psalm 23 refuses that logic. It dares to say, you don't have to wait. You don't have to delay flourishing until life becomes manageable. The table is already being set. And it's not being hidden. It's public, deliberate, and confrontational in the best sense of the word. Not as a means of revenge, but as a testimony to the reality that your life is not dictated by opposition. The phrase, in the presence of my enemies, also speaks to a deeply human fear, the fear of being watched by those who wish us harm, judged by those who misunderstand us, betrayed by those we trusted. But what this verse offers isn't revenge. It's dignity. God doesn't annihilate your enemies in this picture. He simply renders them irrelevant. He lifts you above the need to prove yourself. He feeds you where they expected you to fall. And that's a higher kind of justice, not based on retaliation, but on restoration. Then comes the phrase, You anoint my head with oil. In biblical culture, anointing was symbolic of being chosen, consecrated, honored. Oil was used to mark kings and priests. It was a sign of sacred worth. But in a more personal and psychological sense, to be anointed is to be seen and set apart. It's the opposite of being ignored or dismissed. And for anyone who has wrestled with shame, rejection, or invisibility, this moment is deeply healing. Because God doesn't just feed you. He honors you. And not after the fact, not once you've climbed out of the valley or proven your strength, but you in it, while your enemies still exist, while the battle is still fresh. There's a psychological reality here that's worth exploring. Human beings are meaning-driven creatures. We can endure pain, rejection, and suffering if we believe that something sacred is still at work in us. That's what anointing offers. It's the reminder that your identity is not defined by your struggle. It's defined by the one who knows you, calls you, and prepares a place for you even while the chaos rages. That knowledge can carry you through situations that would otherwise break you. Then the verse says, my cup overflows. That image is powerful not only for its visual symbolism, but for what it represents emotionally. Overflow is not about having just enough. It's about having more than enough. It suggests that the provision of God is not minimal, not cautious, not begrudging. It's extravagant. And here's what's so counterintuitive. This abundance comes while the enemies are still present. Your life is not being rationed. It's being filled to the brim, even while others hope you'll fall. This changes how we view success. It's no longer defined by elimination of problems, but by the presence of grace that exceeds them. That kind of overflow isn't just material. It's emotional, spiritual, relational. It's the peace that passes understanding, the clarity that cuts through confusion, the joy that defies external circumstances. It's what happens when you stop asking, how do I survive? And start asking, what has God already given me in this moment, despite what surrounds me? So when you speak this verse in the morning, you are making a conscious decision to step into dignity. You're choosing not to wait until your enemies disappear or your life becomes easy. You're acknowledging that right now. In the tension and ambiguity, you are seen, provided for, and honored, not by human applause, but by divine intention. And that is where your strength is found, not in the illusion that the world will finally go quiet, but in the confidence that God prepares, anoints, and overflows your life right in the midst of it all. That's not naivety. That's radical courage. And that's how you rise, not because the darkness has gone, but because the light within you refuses to be extinguished.